you're going to attend. So we understand and we are appreciative for the hard work that our legislatures do, but sometimes it does require us to do some rescheduling. So great. And again, good afternoon, everyone. So Alana, do you want to kick things off for us?
Yes, sounds good. Thanks, David. So you'll see, of course, the meeting is being recorded. If anyone does have any difficulty joining, or if you have technical issues while you're in the meeting, please feel free to reach out to me. You can also dial in over the phone. There is a dial-in information provided on our website if you need it. And for the purposes of facilitating the conversation, there are just the few standard operating procedures. The first, of course, is to please mute your line if it's not in use. If there is some additional background noise, we may mute your line for you, but you can always unmute yourself. We ask that you use the raised hand function in Google Meet. So it looks like the little hand at the bottom of your screen. And this will let us know that you would like to speak. For anyone that is joining us over the phone, we'll try to pause from time to time to just ask if anyone has questions or comments. And we just ask that you do announce yourself when speaking. In the unlikely event that the meeting is breached, please just hang up and we will, as quickly as possible, send a new meeting link and phone number to the group. So I will pause there and see if David, if you would like to make any opening remarks. I'm not sure if Ben is on the line yet, but I will hand it back to you for a moment.
Sure. So thank you, everyone. It is 2:30-ish on a Friday afternoon, and we are so fortunate to have your attendance in the work group, the HIE Policy Board meeting this afternoon. We greatly appreciate it. And as I started out by saying a few moments ago, our apologies for needing to reschedule. Sometimes during the legislative session, we get requests to attend meetings, and the legislature really requests that we attend when invited. And that's what we ran against a couple weeks ago. So I appreciate everyone's flexibility. We have a smaller group today, but I think we won't have any trouble working through the sections that Alana has planned. Our executive director, Mr. Ben Steffen, who most of you know and some of you know very well, is not able to be with us. He is detained, but did say he might be able to join us late. And as always, he sends his regards to everyone who is on the call and part of this very important group. So we have an ambitious agenda today. We have lined up 4 sections to try to get through. Let's see how this works out. If we get through them early, we will break. And if it seems like the group is tiring because it is Friday and Friday afternoon, we can also bring the meeting to close a little earlier. But we'll try to make the best use of your time. And as always, everyone's feedback is valued. So please don't be shy, and we'll see where we end up in about an hour and a half to 2 hours. With that, Alana, I'll turn this back to you.
Yep, thanks, David. So during our last meeting on January 10th, we were able to review and discuss draft edits to sections 4, which are the rights of healthcare consumers concerning information accessed, used, or disclosed through an HIE. Section 5, which are requirements for accessing, using, or disclosing health information through an HIE. And then we also began discussions in Section 6 around auditing requirements. So today we will pick it up in Section 6, specifically Section 6A5 for auditing requirements. And Kelly, if you'd like to go ahead and bring up the regulations document, I will hand it back to David and we can begin the discussion. So specifically regarding the auditing requirements, we're looking at A5. So this is ensuring that only authorized users are appropriately authenticated and granted access to HIE information. And the first edit that will be...
Alana, hold on a second. I think we just have to get acclimated. So Kelly, can we just...
sorry, I was going to pause because I don't want her to scroll any further, because what she has up is the appropriate point.
Okay. So, all right. So we're not focusing, I'm sorry to cut you off.
No, it's fine.
So we're focusing on the edits here and not the numeric changes. But in this case, we would be looking at 5A, where it says if an unusual finding involves fewer than 10 patients within 5 business days, that's the first enhancement, or what we should say is it's a draft and it was proposed and we want your feedback on it. So does this seem reasonable? Does it seem appropriate? Is 5 days logical? And I see a couple head nods, but I don't see everyone just because of the number of spaces. So I think Sally, and you're saying it's fine. Anybody think that we need to discuss this because there is it hangs out there and creates pause? Okay, let's travel on. And the next section is B, and it looks like this is a new piece here. The HIE shall perform periodic testing and implement upgrades and updates to ensure that the storage medium is secure and not improperly accessed. Again, this is an addition. Want to check to see if there are any concerns, any discussion that's needed. If I think I see Dr. Suarez Walter.
Yes, hi, David, and thank you. Sorry for a couple of minutes late. Just one comment on the previous one, actually.
Let's go back up.
And it might sound obvious in some cases, but sometimes the findings of something take time before they can be confirmed. So is within 5 business days of confirmation of the unusual findings, is that the expectation? Meaning, it's not suspected unusual findings, but actual confirmed unusual findings?
Yeah, so Kelly, can you scroll up a little bit and let's check it out and just see what it says above. But investigate unusual identified in the access log audit to determine if there has been a violation. So what it's saying is it's neither confirming or denying. It's simply pointing out that there's an unusual finding.
Okay, and I apologize if this has been already covered, but I presume the definition of unusual finding or unusual is somewhere in here.
Well, there's a definition of unusual finding. I actually think it's in O2 if I remembered correctly. But
okay, that's fine. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
You bet. Very good. So let's go back, Kelly, to where we were. Okay, so under B, this is new, so I don't think there was any comments here. This is 8B, main and 8 reaction. Okay. So let's go on to letter B, Bravo. The question here is, we've added the HIE shall promptly and in no event less than 30 days. This speaks to an unscheduled audit. When an HIE has identified a potential violation, the HIE shall promptly and in no event less than 30 days. Something's not right. Should it be in no greater than in something? I'm missing. As I read this out loud now, I'm going, I think we've missed something, because isn't the idea here to get it done within 30 days?
Mm-hmm.
So does this read that way? And in no event less than. It's almost like it's saying don't do it within 30 days, do it greater. Is that my read, or am I reading it incorrectly?
No, the language there's something wrong with the language.
Anyone else see that too, other than me and Sally Ann here?
Well, why couldn't it just read shall promptly conduct an unscheduled audit it within 30 days, that shall.
Okay, so I think you lost, try, so let's try putting that in. So Kelly, can you type in just so we can see what Sally Ann is proposing? Or do you need it to be read again, stated again?
Yeah, the HIE shall promptly conduct an unscheduled audit within 30 days, that shall.
All right, so Alana, you want to take that through for a moment, please?
Sure. So we have suggested changes to modify the language there to be. Does anyone have any concerns or other suggestions regarding the proposed edit there?
Yeah, and let's just make sure or was this just a wording change or are we misinterpreting it? Does anybody, because I think the idea is they're saying it should be done within 30 days as opposed to before it seemed to read in greater than 30. You have to do it in greater than 30 days. Okay.
Yeah, David, my read would probably be that was a typo or just a misword.
No worries. No, that's fine. Okay. No concerns. We'll keep moving. So C under this section, just a word change. HIE shall conduct an annual privacy and security audit in accordance, and then provisions. In provision 1, the audit shall be designed to detect as opposed to aim to detect. And folks, I'm just going to keep reading because there's lots of them here. So if you have concerns, then if you indicate with the hand raised, we'll know to stop and come back. The second provision, an HIE shall develop an auditing policies and procedures to conduct such an audit. Policies and procedures at a minimum. Then we include the items, scope of the audit, a concise description of all documents, and then interviews with relevant staff, responsible person, and the relevant time frame. So let's pause for a moment. Everybody just glance at it again, and then let's see if this seems reasonable. Okay. So Kelly, let's scroll down a little bit. We'll reacclimate ourselves to where we are. Okay, so let's look at the new number 4. If unusual findings are detected, an HIE shall investigate and resolve the matter in accordance with this regulation. 06, and do we need 06? Regulation. Okay, so I was of the mindset we didn't need to call out the section, but it sounds like that we may need to. I'm not hearing any comments, so perhaps that's reflective of the value in leaving that in. So then let's look at D, and so D has been changed. So
So, David, I can provide a little bit of context for this. So there was the addition from Post and Shell to include requirements for the compliance auditing policies and procedures, similar to what we saw above in, I believe that's C2, so where it outlines the requirements for the interviews with staff, responsible person, the relevant timeframes. Those were specific to the annual privacy and security audit. So this is a little bit repetitive of that for a annual compliance audit, but we received feedback that perhaps that level of detail was not needed, and the recommendation was to not include it here, which is why it's crossed through.
Okay, so Alana, in short, this section parallels a prior section as it relates to the audit?
Yes, one is specific to privacy and security audits, and the other is specific to compliance audits.
Okay. Anyone have concerns about what is here? Okay. Let's scroll on down. And all of this section, Alana, can you just summarize this again for us? The deletions here match the prior section?
Yes, so it parallels requirements for policies and procedures for a compliance audit, in line with added requirements for policies and procedures for a privacy and security audit.
Okay. And that also applies to the addition of 1 and 2, the inserts below.
No.
Okay, so this is new language. Correct?
Right. So 1 and 2 are new language. The additions are that the compliance audit requirements specify actions in the event of an unusual finding, and the second allows MHCC to request the involvement of a third-party auditor.
Okay, so let's hold tight for a moment and see what there's any comments here. Okay, I think seeing none, I think we're good to proceed. So let's take a look at E, and this is consistent upon the request of the commission and consistent with the specification of such request. The first one, an HIE shall provide the results of any audit that is required and any supporting documents. And here we've added specification on the timing within 180 days of the initial audit, unless otherwise specified by the commission. Comments? Okay. Anyone feel like 180 days is not, I guess, by virtue of no comments, the assumption here is that it is reasonable to do this within 180 days. Okay. So let's scroll on. Oh, Dr. Suarez.
Yeah, just a quick question. So, I mean, the intent, I suppose, here is to ensure that there are at least 2 audits per year, scheduled audits, and then additional and scheduled audits? Or is this, I mean, I'm trying to think of how many scheduled audits are expected. And then in addition to that, there are also other unscheduled audits based on unusual activities and other things. And on top of that, there could be additional unscheduled audits based on a commission decision, or?
So there's a lot going on in those statements. So I think what we want to do is because we'd have to go back through and look to see when the timing for all the other compliance audit. Let's just look at this specifically as what it says. And we're saying here, upon the request of the commission and consistent with the specifications of such requests. So this relates to a request by the commission. An HIE shall, and that's what that's what we're looking at, is the time frame for that response. Your question about other audits, I would have to go back through it, because I, off the top of my head, with certainty can't remember the timing or the situations of the audits. That's why
I'm just, yeah, thank you for that. I just think it's, the original language is correct in sense of, upon the request of the commission, conduct an additional unscheduled audit. I don't know why 180 days after the initial audit, because it could be 120 days when the commission requests the audit, or 110 days. So having some condition about 180 days adds a variable to the commission being able to request an unscheduled audit at any time. So my sense is, again, why add the 180 days? Why don't we just say, upon the request of the commission, as it says in letter E, and consistent with the specifications, an HIE shall conduct an additional unscheduled audit, just upon the request of the commission. It doesn't have to be.
So what happened? So what might be the situation if somebody says, yeah, we'll do it, and it's the time, there's no real good sense of what's reasonable, because one organization might say, well, we did it in 12 months from the time you asked us. Another might take it as, oh, we did it within 90 days. And someone else may say, well, we think 6 months is reasonable. So I think it's
well, this is 6 months of the initial audit, not 6 months of the commission request.
So I don't know that I followed. In this one, it says upon the request of the commission.
But it says within 180 days of the initial audit. So there's three variables there. The commission asked, the initial audit, and 180 days. And I don't think they work all together well.
No, I hear you. That's a very good point. So the first is the request providing results required in chapter of the initial audit. So it still serves as a guidepost upon that. So I think what this E is not saying that this is the commission is requesting an audit. The commission, upon the request of the commission and consistent with an HIE shall provide the results of any audit. And so I think I hear you. I think you're saying it reads kind of strange, because the way the wording is.
Yeah, what if the commission requests an audit at 180 days since the initial audit?
Right.
Then you have to wait until 180 days and then do the audit. That doesn't make sense.
So
in other words, I don't see the need to add this within 180 days of the initial audit. I think it just, upon the request of the commission, the HIE should conduct an additional unscheduled audit. The commission is going to ask for an additional unscheduled audit based on some evidence or some reason. Whether it's 180 days, 110 days, 250 days after the first initial audit, doesn't matter.
So would it be better if we said something like and provide the results within 180 days of the request to conduct the audit? I mean, is that, because I think the intent here is to put some kind of parameters around time frame.
Time frame from the initial audit, or time frame from when to conduct it after the commission has requested it?
It strikes me it's upon request of the commission to conduct.
But it says of the initial audit.
So if we were to take out within 100, if we were taking out the words of the initial audit out of 2, that would keep a time frame.
Yeah, but then you're giving HIE a 180-day window to conduct the audit. And in the previous paragraph, I think it was conduct the audit within 30 days. So there's that inconsistency.
Yeah. let's
Anyway, just to think about it.
no, that's a good point. Let's get a fresh set of eyes. Adrian, save us here. What do we need?
So I think I'm agreeing with Walter. I think I'm a little confused is the 180 days the time frame from when the commission requests the information be turned over, or is the 180 days from the initial audit, right? So this reads as if, the way I read this is, when the commission, upon the request of the commission, so when the commission requests, you must turn over the results of any audit that's required, and it has to be turned over within 180 days of when the audit was completed. So the commission could potentially ask for an audit at month 5 or month 8. And so it's a little confusing if we're talking about, I think it's just, does the commission want to put a time frame around how quickly the documents have to be turned over once you've made the request? Or does the commission want to make a time frame around how long after the initial audit the documents would need to be turned over? I think it's just a little confusing because it is in the context of at the request of the commission, and we would just presume that when the commission requests, you would give us a time frame for how long we have to turn those documents over, right? So we're requesting it, you've got this much time.
Okay, I think this is helpful. We'll go back and play around with this a little bit. I think I understand better the comments from Dr. Suarez and Adrian, and Kelly's making some notes. So we should be able to work from that and propose something different here with holding on to the intent. So let's go down a little bit. And I think these are just wordsmithing. So if anyone has concerns, we can pause. Okay, Kelly. So in this case, we struck the HIE shall post a publicly available summary report of the audit on the homepage of its website within 30 days. So we heard a lot of railing about on this requirement over time for many, many different reasons. So I think, the posting of the findings gets into the kinds of questions we heard was the depth, the content, the structure, because is it high level and just saying that the audit was good and there were no problems? And so HIEs raised lots of concerns about this. So let's just see what you all think about striking it. And then, well, let's start there. Any concerns about, any thoughts about whether we should keep it or it's okay to potentially strike it?
Hi, David. This is Mike Dennison. How will the HIE then publicly communicate that report? Or is it just removing that obligation?
So in this case, it removes the obligation altogether. And the question becomes is what do we do with it if we leave? And to some extent, that's what folks are saying. It's not, these audits aren't consumer friendly. I mean, you would have a hard time if you were a consumer making sense of it. They can be very technical, and it can create more confusion because of the level of technicality. Now, if we're saying it could be a 1 or 2 liner, essentially that says, company X was audited independently under its privacy and security policies and was deemed to be in compliance. That would be understandable to a lot of folks, but otherwise, this is where we would run into trouble. So, so let me go first to Dr. Connor. Dr. Connor? And you're muted. Still muted.
Now I'm okay. Yep, I am. Okay, the first comment I have is similar to what we just heard, and that is the how. How will they get information about the report? But more importantly, to your comments in response to that, is what will they get that will be understandable for them, that will make sense to them. What I find sometimes when I even go out there just to look every now and then to see what's out there and available for the general public or consumer, sometimes it's 50 feet and it may not make a difference. I guess I'm wondering, how do you make it be down to a fifth grade level, just thinking that way, or such a level point that they can really understand it? When you get rankings for hotels and other places or products that you use, it's usually something basic that they can readily look at or see, or like you're suggesting or saying that they get nothing. But I think that would be a misnomer, something I would not suggest you do, not to give them something. If the report was done, some feedback needs to be given and written for the public to see.
So that's interesting. Let me thank you for that. Let me go back to Mike for a moment. Mike, I have a question for you. Does Change Healthcare make some level of information from its audits, not financial audit, but from its privacy and security audit, distilled for consumers in general?
Yes, we do. We basically, we have our accreditations and certifications website that lists all of our accreditations and certifications, and basically kind of an in English explanation of what that certification or accreditation does and supports. And we reflect any, basically go back to the certifying website to show our status, and also provide any documentation that they provided to us to publicly display that accreditation. ENAC is a good example of how we demonstrate our compliance to the industry.
Okay, so that's a good
Third-party assessment that they
Yeah.
provide.
That's a good point. So there's some. So rather than saying not do nothing, you're saying it's better to break it down so it's understandable, and you present something back to the general public on your website.
Correct.
So let me just ask others. Anyone? I think what we're hearing is we need to do something. The question becomes is how do we guide? How do we articulate doing presenting information back in a way that's not overly burdensome for the organization, but it's understandable for the average person who might click on it. So I think that's the goal we have to come back to. So I think that's a very good point. I would just be curious. I don't know, Adrian, in your experience working with some of the other HIEs, have you seen information on their websites that relates to audits?
No, I think that's the kind of the issue, right? The idea that there's not much you can say publicly other than, an audit was done, and not sure whether that's really valuable or potentially you cause security risks if you give too much information. So I don't know if Craig, if you've had other thoughts with talking to our security team.
Yeah, I mean, so I agree about the point that we need to be thoughtful about what we disclose to the public for, as it relates to security and those kinds of details. I also wonder if we're really talking about consumer information, maybe this goes back to consumer disclosures and patient engagement, not necessarily an audit section requirement, if we think that this needs to be kind of plain language description for consumers. But maybe my last and final point might be, I can almost see it as the commission's obligation. If an HIE fails an audit or does not respond to an audit or has unsavory findings, it seems like the regulator's role to do something through certification and notifying consumers, not necessarily the HIEs.
I don't know that we would. I think there would be action by the regulating body, but I also don't think. I think if whether it's a consumer or a trading partner just wants to have a better understanding of how the organization fared, I think that's what I'm hearing from Dr. O'Connor and Mike. But but I'm not sure. But I think let's go back to I think it's Dr. O'Connor and then Mike. Let's see what your thoughts are. I'm thinking that what we're hearing is that we need something. I don't know that I would specifically hang it on the shoulders that this is for consumers only, but it is public facing. So I guess, Craig, to your point, to some extent it does impact consumers, but let's see what others think. Dr. Connor and then
Mike. You look for me to give more comment about it. I think
your hand was raised, so I don't know if you were.
Oh, no. I'm trying to switch from my telephone to the computer. I'm sorry if it is raised. Forgive me.
No worries. Mike, is yours new or was it?
No, I'll add some more flavor. Obviously, the Maryland Healthcare Commission itself also certifies EHNs, and Change Healthcare does also tout our MHCC certification, as well as High Trust and other third party. I think the goal is not to necessarily air the dirty laundry in the audit report itself and everything associated with that, but more so to provide assurance to the users or the people that utilize the HIE that there is some sort of third party or internal or commission assessment that's being made, and that the HIE is maintaining that integrity.
Yeah, these are good points. So I think we've captured the spirit of what you all are saying, and we'll make some tweaks here and come back to you all. So Kelly, do you want to scroll down a bit more? Okay, so
Sorry, so the next section I think is the addition there in G, David. So directly under what we were just talking about in 3.
okay, an HIE audit reveals information demonstrates a pattern of noncompliance. The HIE will use the findings to educate and train its workforce, evaluate and implement new control measures. And the HIE shall take appropriate measures specified in 07. So these are additions. Any reaction here? I mean, they seem pretty logical. You would think folks would do that anyway. Except in 07, we will take a look at that as we get there. Okay, let's travel along. So under H, there's looks like mostly just wording under H, and then under H1. So signed versus performed by. Let's see if that has any reaction from the group and the changes into the language. Okay. Let's go down. You see where now H3 has been struck. Let's pause for a moment. Any concerns about the strike through here? Okay. Ellie, you want to travel along a little bit more? Okay, so let's pause for a moment. So we are taking out all that preceding section, and let's just make sure there are no trailing thoughts. Okay, let's go on to 07. And Alana, I'm going to let you tee this section up.
Okay. So 07 is the remedial actions to be taken by an HIE. The first change we have is just wording. We deleted serious before harm to kind of broaden that, not looking to make any judgment as to what is serious harm versus harm. We also have an addition to suspend a person's access to prevent noncompliance with the chapter or with state or federal regulations.
So there's a lot here in this screenshot. Let's just take a moment, everyone, and read it and see if there's anything that creates pause. Okay, let's go down a little bit.
So if we go to A2, there's the addition that just adds the allowance for an HIE to end the suspension of a person's access if it is determined that there is no threat of harm to the privacy or security of health information.
David, I've got my hand up for a quick question.
Okay. Sure, go ahead, Dr. Cohen.
It goes back up to, I think it's 4, and it might give me some curiosity question about the ones we're discussing now. It talked about, can we go back up? Because I was trying to read it, the one above this one. Some of the things we've crossed out for. Let me see this one right here. In order to conduct a quarterly review, the HIE shall provide a participating organization audit records. I was thinking, how, if we don't do this, how can we do some of the actions that are going forward that we're talking about doing? How will we give them feedback on how they're performing and what they're doing? And how can you suspend them if you don't have data that you collected? What will be your process?
Okay, so let's scroll, Kelly, let's go up a little further. So give everyone a chance to see how it flows. And then we'll answer Dr. Connor's question. So if a participating organization does not conduct an audit, it shall review the access logs relating to the participating organization within 10 days of receipt from an HIE. An HIE shall send HIE access logs to participating organizations no less than. So the notion of access logs in the HIE, I feel like this is managed at the actual provider site as opposed to the HIE. And HIEs were of the mindset that they don't even have the capability to do this because it's handled by the users, and the agreements in place with the users requires them to do it and notify the HIE. So Adrian or Craig, is that correct?
I think it depends. In many cases, we do have access logs and we would provide them. In other cases, we leave it up to participants, those that are more sophisticated or receiving raw data and kind of pushing it through their own systems as appropriate and allowable. My general take is that, if we're going to shut off access, we're going to work with the participant about why we did that, what the effect might be, and how the user can get their access back. And so I think that we would probably do this as a natural business course or as a requirement as a partner to our participants. And therefore, it probably does not need to be specified in regulation.
So I guess then when we go down to 7, I'm just thinking, what will you have to support your actions if you don't collect it up here in 3 and 4? That was just my thinking.
So no, let's see. It's a good point. Let's see how it flows. HIE shall immediately suspend a person's access to the HIE when it's necessary to avoid serious harm to the privacy and security of health information. So it doesn't necessarily say this. It leaves open the trigger event, if you will, but they'll suspend it in order to prevent serious harm. So that could be a notification from the provider, could be notification from the organization. It could be identification of, as we heard Craig say, they have in some cases they have this information anyway. And so that's really what O7A is saying.
Okay, so but I was just wondering, what do you use for a tracking device? What do you have to show them that this is why your reasoning behind it? If you didn't track it, you didn't have anything up above to do it. And I understand what Craig is saying. Craig is absolutely right. You should have a congenial relationship, communicate with them and all. But I'm just wondering, what do you actually show from a record keeping kind of standpoint?
So, Adrian, your thought, I think, can you answer Dr. Connor's question?
I may be able to. Can you scroll back up just really quickly? I think the what's being stricken here is not the requirement that the HIE would have these logs. It's the requirement that the participating organization be provided with those logs, and the requirement on the participating organization to do this review. So I think that's what's actually being removed here, not the requirement that the HIE has. We have to have access matrices and understand who's having the data. Okay. So I think, to your point, Dr. Connor, I think that's still going to be required from an HIE perspective. I think what's not required is, by striking this, is the requirement to provide that information to the participating organization and all of the downstream requirements for them to review all of that logs. And back to Craig's point, a lot of the participants already have this because the information is in their own EHR. So we work with them anyway, but that's how I read this is what's being stricken here, is that it's the participating organization's review requirement.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think that's fair, because it says in D, a review of user access logs to ensure that only authorized users. Kelly, I can't keep up. You're bouncing all over the place. I'm sorry. Okay. A review of user access logs to ensure that only an authorized user is appropriately authenticated. And then number 3 says, if a participating organization does not conduct its own audit, the HIE access, it shall review the HIE access logs. So that's what so I think, to Adrian's point, it's not suggesting that it does or does not do it. It's just saying, if you do not use your logs, you should be using the HIE. And I think Craig and Adrian are saying that in few instances would an organization not have access logs.
Okay.
And let me just, before we go, but these are great questions. Thank you. So I don't know, Angela, did you have a question or comment to this particular point? I've seen you come and go a little bit with hands. I'm not sure. I don't want to.
Yeah, well, I did have a comment on the next section, but I think Dr. Connor brings up a good point. I think under D, we're talking about HIE, looking at the HIE access logs just for appropriate authentication. Now, we know that there are other privacy security risks besides authentication that could sort of go awry with a user. And I think that was the intent under 3, that it would be looking at sort of the general use to determine whether or not it's necessary to sort of cut off that access. So what I'm saying is, does D, in saying appropriately authenticated, go far enough to then justify an HIE acting under the next section to make a determination whether or not there's harm to the private security of the HIE?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a good point. We're going to make a comment to look at this more closely, but I wondered if there was anyone else that has a reaction to the point that Angela just made. Okay. Yeah, I think these are good comments. We'll take a look at them and we can come back. Okay, Alana.
Okay. So picking up then with 07B, there's an addition.
I think Angela's saying we're going too fast. Is that right?
Sorry, no. Well, this is my original hand raise when we were talking about remedial action. So, sort of thinking through the lens of an HIE, not sort of the model of CRISP, but maybe the model of an HIE of the Epics and the Cerners of the world. Is there an opportunity, and is it addressed sort of in the regs for the HIE that's acting more like an EHR to suspend access to that EHR that has HIE capabilities without necessarily cutting off that person's ability to document in the EHR?
So that's a really interesting point. I can tell you, I don't think we've thought enough about this because, but that's an excellent point you're bringing up. So we want to definitely make a note of that because, typically, historically, these regulations were geared at brick and mortar HIEs, I think everyone has a general sense, meaning that your business model was serving as an intermediary, moving information, doing some analysis, but generally moving information, health information. And now now that we know that particularly ONC is including it in their information blocking rule, software developers that have modules certified by ONC as an HIE vendor, if you will. And so part of what we're trying to do in modernizing these regulations, being very fortunate to work with the folks from Post and Shell, is to really kind of incorporate those kinds of additions. So I don't feel like we've called that out perhaps enough, but I think, Angela, to your point, we should go back and look at it. Now I say that, but let's see what others think. I think Lois, I'm sorry.
It's Louise.
Louise, I'm sorry. I'm looking far.
Yeah,
Okay.
just along those lines, I know if we cut off some person's access, we're going to get, nailed for information blocking, because that would be the very first. I know, because we have cut off people's access sometimes when we are concerned about their electronic prescribing for controlled substances, and it becomes a big issue. So, I mean, cutting off their access, is a big problem, and they're telling you that it's a patient safety issue. But beyond that, I'm trying to figure out exactly like what we're auditing, because you probably, well, maybe you don't know, but we don't set the access controls for, who can access the software. That's set by the practice itself. So they determine who within their practice is going to have access to what part of their software. I mean, we obviously control external access, and we track any, person, say, at our company that might try to access a provider's information, or any external force that might try to access the information. But we don't, control or have the ability to even see most of the time the access, of the providers themselves.
Yeah, and so from the HIE utility perspective, I would say that the aiming point is, as you've just mentioned, it's what's in the span of control of the organization in terms of the HIE, because you're right, you can't know if a consumer was nefariously accessed the EHR of a provider who's using your services. But as you noted, you can tell if someone in your organization is trolling around looking at records. You can tell if somebody's hacked their way into it, if you will. So there are things you can control, and I think that's the span where control comes in. I think Angela brings up a good point around where can an HIE provide assistance on the auditing and the remedial actions, if you will, to one of its end users. Maybe the policy answers it can't, and it shouldn't. But I think that Angela raises a good point that we ought to at least give some more thought to. But clearly, with any organization that meets the definition of an HIE, you can only be responsible for what's in your what I would say was on your radar screen. I mean, so if it's not a service you provide or related to a service you perform, then the regulations would not be holding that organization accountable for it. Okay, Alana.
Okay. So 7B.
Could I just ask, I mean, are you going to in some way, put that in the regulations or in the commentary so that it's clear?
Yeah, I think that's a fair, definitely a fair request. I think we need to spell it out. And I think you're saying, maybe we can't say where at this very moment, but I think you're saying it needs to be articulated. I think that's reasonable.
Okay.
It's new for us. So as we are thinking about modernizing the regulations, this is the kind of input that's very helpful in ensuring that we don't leave gaps. So yeah, thank you for that point.
Okay. So 7B gets at conducting an investigation if there's reason to believe that there was a breach or non-HIPAA violation. We have several additions. The first being a reference to we've added non-compliance with applicable state and federal law in addition to that breach and non-HIPAA violation. I think there was some feedback that this may be somewhat repetitive or duplicative language here. So I can pause there or go through the further additions if no one has comment.
Yeah, I think that seems at least B seems to make sense, because what we're saying is if there's something in law or federal law.
David, Alana, I checked this one only because it says applicable state and federal law. I just wondered if that was too broad.
So Kelly, we can make a note of that. I think that's, we're fortunate to have lots of really good attorneys, both in the state and as our partners in working through this regulation. So we can pose that to them. I think Mike, you had sorry, hold on just a second, Mike. Sally Ann. Was there other comment here?
No.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Mike. Go ahead.
Yeah, just the word breach in B there. That could either be a privacy or security breach. Do we want to be more specific?
That's a good point too. Yeah, so let's make a note, because I think the intent is probably both, but we'll take a look. For Friday afternoon, I applaud you all. You're catching things that we've looked at this 100,000 times and we've missed.
Okay, so for B1, we've made the addition to begin an investigation immediately. There's also an addition so the initial addition is to simultaneously notify the commission of all facts and circumstances, but we did get feedback that perhaps rewording that would be beneficial, so that the requirement is to notify MHCC as soon as the investigation starts. But that could be problematic because all of the facts and circumstances may not yet be established. So any thoughts on the wording?
Mike, go ahead, please.
Yeah, there are potentially also federal regulations that notifications that must be made and timeframes to make those notifications. So not just notify the commission, but also notify as applicable per federal regulation.
Mm-hmm. So we'll add that as a comment. Yeah. And these should begin the investigating meeting. Notify the commission. Facts. Yeah, I mean, I think, so do we, so I think, Mike, I think, okay, I think that makes a good point. Let's definitely take a look at that. So Craig, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I agree that the word simultaneously is problematic, and I also agree that notifying the commission when you start an investigation is hard, just because the whole purpose of the investigation is to gather facts so we can be educated as we share those facts. I'm also a little bit concerned about the addition of other non-compliance. I mean, we have 60,000 users, and I always think there's potential non-compliance happening, and so there's just a lot of variation in what non-compliance could mean, and the way we handle it, if and how it's reported or suspected. That might just be too broad for me.
Yeah, let's highlight and make a note on the other non-compliance, because that's a wide range, if you will. Allegations and this. So in this case, allegations of the investigation. So do we need any, maybe what we're missing here as well is any parameters around when to notify the commission? Because for example, like ONC uses reporting based upon thresholds, financial thresholds about, after the fact. Do we need, is there some kind of threshold? Because I don't know. Maybe we have to give more thought to this, but do you all think we need any kind of threshold around, what kind of potential breaches to notify and when? Adrian, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I just wanted to echo what Craig was saying, that our security team is constantly either investigating or thinking about investigating, and not necessarily because there's always going to be a potential HIPAA breach, but they just they take it very seriously. And so I do have a concern that if every time they started what they thought was an investigation, they had to notify the commission, that could be burdensome, especially before all the facts and circumstances are found out. Like, for example, I got a notification from them the other day that they had gotten a notification from Microsoft Office that I had clicked on a malicious link in my email. I was like, I promise, Bez, I didn't click on a malicious link. And so, they take everything very seriously. And so I think we want to make sure that they continue to do that, and that they don't feel like, they shouldn't take everything very seriously and investigate everything if they have to notify the commission that they've started an investigation, especially when things get wrapped up very quickly, that there's been a false positive or something. So
That's exactly
just want to put that out there.
Well, so I think Mike put in the chat a website we can take a look at, and Craig, you may want to keep a closer eye on Adrian, because it sounds like she's doing some things she shouldn't ought to be doing there. So.
Luckily, I don't have to. She was investigated.
That's very good. Okay, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Adrian, for that. So let's go on down.
Okay.
David, this
Yes.
is I do think though that there should, it should be something like, as soon as the HIE determines that it's a reasonably credible investigation, that the MHCC should be notified.
Yeah, some kind of trigger event.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea. And we'll look at what Mike sent us, because it may be articulated well there. Thank you, Mike. Or was that Angela? Oh, I think Angela has one too. Okay, very good. Thanks, Angela. All right, Lana.
All right. The next edition, B2, includes recommendations to include third parties if the HIE does not possess the ability, knowledge, or experience in investigating cybersecurity breaches.
Any comments, reactions here?
Isn't having either a contractor, someone internally to do this part of the certification?
When you say certification, I'm not
As
sure.
an HIE? I mean, like an ENAC certification or something like, I mean, isn't that part of the requirements?
Well, because there are lots of accrediting and bodies out there. For example, if you're a software developer, you're not using, you may not use, or you may use something completely.
Another one.
Yeah. So this, it feels like this is good guidance that's here, as opposed to anything else. Because I would think that logically, this would be the case if you have the wherewithal internally. And I think, oftentimes elements of the regulation are best practices. And I think this is one of those situations. Okay.
Okay, so the next addition is to specify the amount of time to make a written finding describing the results of the investigation, making a copy available to the commission. It's within 2 business days. I think we heard some feedback that maybe that was a little bit too short of a timeline.
So yeah, I mean, what would be reasonable? And Craig, what do you think would be a reasonable time frame?
Yeah. I don't know. First, I'm struck that there's a 14-day requirement in number 4, and then it's shrunk to a 2 business day requirement in 4A. That just seems inconsistent. I don't know. I mean, so I guess if that's at the completion of the investigation, then documentation would be complete. And so sharing the findings of the investigation within 2 business days seems okay. That part doesn't bother me.
Yeah, I think you're concerned about the 14-day window. So I would say maybe we need to note the 14-day piece and come back to it. And I say that because if it's a complex investigation,
That's my point.
it's not done in 14 days. But I think what there is some communication, because I don't think the regulating body should be left in the dark if it takes you 90 days. And there should be some kind of communications along the way. And maybe we can make a note and take it back to our friends at Post and Shell and get some guidance, because I think what we've heard is that there are most incidents these days, the situation is too complex. I mean, to really complete an investigation within 14 days. Now, there's intelligence that's gathered along the way, and I think the purpose originally here is to communicate, to create that sharing of information. So there's awareness on the regulator's part. And I think that's something we probably want to come back to and take a look at.
Yeah.
Dr. Connor, go ahead.
I was going to say something similar to that, and that one, we may want to have like various time frames depending upon the complexity of what the investigation reveals. And it could be like a gradation, and the days could vary.
There's something there. I think having the expectation that everybody would complete a full-blown audit investigation rather than 14 days is probably wouldn't happen in the best case scenarios anymore. Craig, is that your sense too?
Yeah, I think I'm just generally agreeing that, what we're all trying to do is investigate when there's a serious reason to believe an investigation is necessary, and then communicate openly and honestly with our regulator at some kind of natural period. And so, I think there's probably a lot of room for simplification in this section to make it easier to comply, but also to make sure that we're accomplishing what we think we need to, right? Which is consistent and open communication.
Yeah, agreed. So Kelly's making some notes on that, and we'll raise that with our, as I said, our friends at Post and Shell, and come back to you all. Okay, Alana.
Okay, so then the next addition is, again, upon the completion of that investigation, it just calls out that if necessary, remedial action will be taken, in alignment with regulation 7C.
And that's this next section.
Right. So the first addition to 7C is just another nod to state and federal law in addition to the breach and non-HIPAA violation. And then there's a deletion that removes the time restriction here in this language to allow for calling out of more specific timing requirements in the subsections below.
Okay, so let's pause. I think Angela wants us to have this in 2 days. Angela, 2 days?
No, I was just going to make a note about the addition of non-compliance with applicable state and federal law. I know it was noted above that might be a bit broad. If you look at the definition of a non-HIPAA violation, it sort of includes, something that's inconsistent with state or federal law, this chapter. So maybe that's encompassing in the definition, and if it's sort of part of the definition of non-HIPAA violation, it could be also too broad, depending on what the group thinks.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we'll go back, note to self here, Kelly. Let's check on the definition, look to see how non-HIPAA breach, how that is worded. I think, I can remember back to some of the intent from a decade ago, but we'll go back and check. Thanks, Angela.
Okay, so under C, the first addition is the timeline of 5 business days for an HIE to determine remedial action necessary to address a breach or violation. And then within that, there is the addition that includes examples of what the remedial actions may be.
So I want to go back to a benchmark. I think sometimes having a goal, but in 5 days, I want to get folks' feedback. Should it be that there has to be a reasonableness in terms of the timing, but do we measure it as a 5-day rule? Thoughts? Dr. Connor.
Should it concur with the decision that you make on the one up above about when you report it or respond to it? Should it have something to do, some correlation to that one?
So let's scroll up a little bit, Kelly. Let's just see what it is. We can.
As we said, 14, we were, trying to decide 14 business days, 2 business days, to about making a written finding. So should the language be similar there and here?
I think the goal of having timeframes is good, but I feel like there's so many extraneous variables to say with precision that thou shall do in 5 days or
Right.
14 days. I think we're hearing that we ought to have benchmarks, we ought to have goals, but maybe there's a way to allow them to be more organization specific. I don't know. I think we have to raise this back to the attorneys to see what's reasonable, because one organization could be super fast in terms of its audit and compliance activities. And what I think we see, the bigger the organization, sometimes they can move swift, but other times it takes a while. So is it really reasonable to hold people accountable to a hardcore number of days, as opposed to making sure there are some kind of goals around time frames? That would be a thought that comes to mind. And Haley, I think you have your hand up, and then we'll
It's
go to-
Sally. Actually, for whatever reason, my granddaughter's name shows up. But I do think maybe we can look at it in two stages, preliminary, because I do think there needs to be not haste, but there needs to be some proactive action. So maybe we create an interim. So there's preliminary investigations or preliminary remedial plans, primarily to get it reported back to the Maryland Healthcare Commission, so that, that we can create trust within the community, within our consumers, that when something does happen, we move on it quickly, but also be fair to the HIE and making sure that then they have sufficient time to close the case.
Yeah, that's really the point I think we're trying to get at and how we get at it. So I think that's a great point. So Craig and then Dr. Suarez.
Yeah, I wonder if it might be helpful kind of in between meetings if we create almost like a notification matrix that says, for HIPAA violations, we need this in this time frame, and for non-HIPAA, we need this in this time frame. And because it strikes me that we would treat the type of violation different based on the severity in federal and state law, and it might just help us kind of simplify and decide, like, how do we want to respond to each of these different types of events.
So sure, Craig, that's a good point.
Good idea.
The question though is, it still puts a structure that in the end, that approach will create a structure, whether it's 3 days or 10 days. And is that rigidity? And so to some HIEs, maybe it's reasonable to do it in 2 days, and others might say, look, it takes us 20 days. And if we say, well, then it should be 20 days, is that really reasonable overall? It might be very reasonable for one HIE. So I hear you. I just don't know if that still holds a very rigid process without having and eliminates discretion, or maybe.
I think that's a place to start, and we can put in and maybe add some of the other certification agencies or something, so that we can get some benchmarks as to what the industry feels is reasonable.
Yeah.
And I'd almost argue, the point of the regulations are to drive the outcomes you need. And so if you demand HIPAA violations at a certain time frame, then that's why you create a rigid regulation. If you feel that's necessary to have more flexibility for non-HIPAA violations because they're treated with less severity, then you could make those more open-ended.
Understood. Thank you. Dr. Suarez and then Mike.
Yeah, thank you. I have a couple of points I think I'd like to make. The first one is a more overarching question, and I've been thinking about as we go through these HIE requirements. Presumably, this is requirements upon an HIE with respect to the information and the systems they, let's call it, quote unquote, control. Meaning, there are situations where an HIE becomes aware of a potential breach or violation by one of its members, for example. But again, I presume that all these requirements that are related to that HIE apply to the data insofar that it is inside or within the systems and the control of the HIE, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I just wanted to clarify that that's the case. The other thing is, I think we need, I like the idea of having a table, and I think what we're going to find is we become very complex very quickly by fragmenting all sorts of different types of violations or breaches and so I was trying to just simplify things, because otherwise, some things might be considered a HIPAA related item, but not others, and it becomes very difficult to do. So, and in C, for example, in this statement under C, it gives the impression that it's about everything, because it says non-HIPAA violation, then it says breach under HIPAA, so that's HIPAA violations, and then non-compliance with applicable state and federal law. So it pretty much covers everything. Even some people would argue, what is the non-compliance related to? Is it non-compliance with applicable privacy and security, state and federal laws, or other aspects of non-compliance? So anyway, I think it's, I like the idea of having the table, because that's going to uncover the complexities that we might get into, and then I think we will want to find a simplified approach. And then the last item I wanted to suggest is, I mean, all these days and dates and timeframes are somewhat artificial in many ways. I mean, there are outbounders and maximums or not to exceed kind of things, but there has to always be a way to permit an extension, a request for an extension for instances where the investigation is taking longer than 14 business days or 2 business days or things like that. So I don't know if that language is available, that there could be a request for an extension. But anyway.
Yeah, no, I think you're articulating this very well, and so thank you. The at issue is what constitutes a reasonable trigger. So, and then what is the reasonable amount of days, and how do you allow for some flexibility without being so rigid that it's impossible for some and accomplishable for others? And I think that's something we have to really give some more thought to, because many years ago, this is going back a long ways, there was just one HIE in Maryland, and a lot of this was crafted with the thinking of what would how would this organization be able to respond. And now we know that's not the case anymore. So it makes it a little bit more tricky to work through sections like this one and others, frankly. But that's kind of the feedback you all are giving us. So that's very helpful. So Mike, what is your thoughts here?
Well, I'll piggyback a little bit on what Craig had said, in that with HIPAA, there are defined timelines in the regulation as to when to notify and those types of things. So I think if you segment them out and say, if it's a HIPAA violation, it has to follow federal breach notification requirements. And then for non-HIPAA, we could also, instead of, I think that if you look again at the government, how they proceed with things in enforcement, they require a corrective action plan that then includes the time frame for the milestone steps to correct the error or the breach, and then there's an acceptance by MHCC that plan looks realistic and attainable.
That's
and
right.
Then both parties agree to it and execute.
That's an excellent point. So I think, Mike, you're saying just perhaps the answer here is parallel more closely how it's handled at the federal level for both HIPAA and non-HIPAA violations.
Yeah, and really let the time frame dictate. Obviously it could be large or it could be small or it could be jumbo. So I think the corrective action plan would set some of those milestones, and really all you're looking for is, when are you going to get that corrective action plan?
That's right, and that's right, and that's correct. That's a very good point. Okay. Let's travel down a bit more, Alana.
Okay, so I think several of the additions following that fall in the same vein and probably are relative to the comments that have been made. There was an addition of including PHI with sensitive health information. So a copy of the findings of the investigation will exclude PHI and sensitive health information, just making that call out there. Then I think the next addition that doesn't fall under the comments that have been made under 2E, we have the addition that expands on the example of actions taken for non-compliance with remedial actions. So it says, in any future action that the HIE may take, including suspension of access or progressive discipline. if the person does not comply with the remedial action.
Okay. Words, I don't think that's a problem. Let's scroll down a bit.
Okay, then the next addition to 4 specifies notification to the consumer if the HIE determines it is required due to severity. So it kind of moves or places the ownership within this requirement on the HIE instead of on MHCC per the deletion below.
So let's hold on. So I think so why couldn't it be both? I mean, I think from the regulator standpoint, we want to be able to hold on to the discretion to do that. But more importantly, that the HIE has the discretion. The HIE determines notification required. The HIE should determine it based on severity of the breach. So think about that for a moment, everyone. I mean, what if the HIE, how do you harmonize the severity and breach between different interpretations? Because Dr. O'Connor, as a consumer, may go, this is really severe to me, and I wish you all had told me, air quote, and the HIE might say, well, we don't think this was a big deal, so we didn't tell anyone. And we as the regulators might say, oh no, we think it's a big deal as well. So I don't know about this one. I look forward to people's comments here. Anybody have any thoughts?
David, this is Sally.
Please go ahead.
I just thought that the additional language was redundant and actually confusing. That it was clearer in its original language that you'll notify the consumer pursuant to the regulation and to HIPAA. And there's some definition in the HIPAA. And that the new language just now we have to define what severity is.
Yeah, because there's going right, and that's the thing that even if we keep the language, that's the piece that confuses me.
Right.
How do you interpretation is very important, and what our attorneys will tell us in the regs is that the more you can spell out, the better you are, as opposed to having people.
Well, and I don't think we should create new definitions.
Right.
That we should rely on what is already in the regulations as much as possible.
Okay. That's a very good point. So let's note this, and I would also say that if so directed by the commission due to the seriousness, I think if so directed by the commission, I think taking out those extra words is probably fine, because at the end it's if directed by the commission. But Dr. O'Connor, thank you, Sally. Dr. O'Connor, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are similar to what Sally just said. I think less is better in this case. And I think when you put words like severity, breach, or violation, that tend to bring a more fear, more concern for people to want to know more and for you to have more to explain. So I think if you just keep it simple, it will be fine. But I do agree that you need to say something and make it as simplistic as you possibly can.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Connor. Dr. Suarez.
Well, I add my agreement with the concepts mentioned before, and I think the interesting part is that there are differences in terms of thresholds for under which notification to consumers is required. The HIPAA, there is the 500 threshold in which, the entity has to inform OCR and it get posted on a website. And then there are the 50 case thresholds for communicating to consumers. And then you look at state by state, and there are differences in terms of the size and the threshold. So here, I think it would be helpful to reference whether it's whether we're following. I don't recall if Maryland. I think Maryland has a threshold as well, which is different from the threshold used by HIPAA, if I'm not mistaken. But if it's not, then we can just reference that as the threshold. And by the way, I don't think severity is. I mean, if it's one disclosure of one data element that is identifiable to an individual, that's severe enough in many ways. I mean, again, the threshold is the number of cases, and if it's 50, it doesn't matter if it's 50 of the entire medical record or if it's 50 of just one data element for each of the 50. It's a breach of 50, and that's really the guiding threshold, really the guiding principle for the reportability. So I agree. I think it's simplifying it and trying to align and clarifying whether the threshold is, because if we say it under regulation 0.08, and then we also say applicable laws including HIPAA, then it creates which is the lowest one, because that's the one I have to comply with. If HIPAA is 500 and Maryland is 50, and I have to follow Maryland because it's the 50.
So Kelly, we'll just note to take a look at this section, ask our friends again from Post and Shell if they could take a look at this and give us their thoughts based upon what we were hearing today. Very good. Great comments, great feedback. Thank you all. Alana?
Okay, so the next addition in E includes a requirement to permanently revoke a person's access to the HIE if it was suspended more than once.
So I always wonder about these kinds of things. If you're a physician and your access is permanently revoked, who loses more? Is it the physician or the patients that you treat? And there seems like there are really good arguments on both sides, and I'm always, this leaves me a little bit of a head scratcher. Do we say that the physician shouldn't be allowed to have access to this information anymore? I'm curious to get some thoughts on this. Dr. Schwartz, what does Kaiser do?
I'm trying to track. You're referring to the letter E?
Yeah, in general. So if a provider were to access inappropriately a patient's record, is it just termination, or do they go, look, we give you a warning once, and then if you do it again, we terminate you? Or how does that?
Well, yeah, no. Not all the cases are the same, of course, but there's an investigation that is open. And it's of course, it's based on, the degree to which inappropriate access was done, and in some cases, if it's a physician or a clinician, not necessarily a physician, but there are, break the glass kind of situations where the physician needed to, or the clinician needed to access it, but it gets documented and then it gets audited, and but there's if there is a finding of an inappropriate one, once it's determined it's inappropriate, then there's an investigation, and that investigation could lead to a number of actions, including and up to suspension or firing, based on the complexity or the situation itself, whether it was a consistent practice or consistent action, or whether it was an accidental one or an inappropriate one that was the first one. I mean, so yeah, there is an investigation open, and given a series of considerations that come out of the investigation, then there's specific actions taken, including, again, up to suspension. But it's not an automatic suspension or an automatic firing. It goes through an investigation and a determination of the elements of that inappropriate
Right.
access or access or disclosure, for that matter.
Right. So this item suggests that the due diligence is done, and I, David Sharp, am guilty, and it happens once that I'm guilty, and then it happens a second time that I'm guilty. So I think the progression of the investigation has already deemed me to be non-compliant or violator, if you will. And I think so. Your feedback, of course, is very helpful here. Craig, what do you think?
Yeah, I just think the HIE needs discretion in these kinds of decisions. Given the HIE the option of permanently revoking access if there's been 2 proven violations is one thing, but I think forcing any HIE to do that could be problematic.
Okay. Kelly, if you can note that as well. Sally.
I agree with Craig. I think that, the HIE may want to put them on some kind of high-level monitoring or something, because in the end, it's the patient that is going to suffer. And the HIE can make a determination whether the provider or whomever in question, is just simply being flagrant and needs to be suspended. But if there's a way to remediate the situation, I think we don't want to create a barrier for high quality care for patients.
Yeah, and I wonder if it's just what I think I hear everyone saying is that you have to have a clearly defined policy how these are managed. And maybe that policy, I don't know if that policy is something that's made available to consumers, and I'll just pick on consumers for a moment because it's their information that could be accessed, that articulates the policy. Because but it has to be reasonable policy too. I mean, I could see it being very so loose.
Yeah, I think the policy has to be done and made available both to the consumers and to the users, so that they understand the expectations regarding access. Now, the other element, of course, is if there was an inappropriate access, then there's a possibility that the cause. I mean, there's a root cause analysis also that has to be done, and to determine whether it was a vulnerability of a system that permitted that inappropriate access,
Right.
and that would need to be fixed as well, not just penalize the actual user that performed that access inappropriately, but maybe they perform it because it was available. It was they were able to do it, and they didn't realize it was inappropriate because the system was actually permitting it by virtue of a vulnerability or a flaw.
Yeah, that's a great point. I concluded that to some extent was what Craig was saying as well. Okay, this is very helpful. Alana?
Okay, so in F, there are a few additions to kind of broaden or expand the requirements here to participating organizations. So essentially, this says a person may file a written notice or request with the commission that the commission review an HIE's or participating organization's action if there's reason to believe that the HIE or participating organization has acted inappropriately, and then a couple of deletions in 1 and 2 to align with that.
Okay. I think we can travel along.
Okay, so in G, there is just addition of some wording to specify that a copy of notices of suspension or reinstatement be sent to MHCC. And that is the final edit in section 7.
Okay, but let's hold on to that for a moment, because I sort of wonder, copy of it, I can't imagine what we would do with it and why we would need it. I mean, as I think about that, I go, do I need to know that person X? I just don't know. I just don't see how that, as a regulating body, that level of detail is useful. I just don't. So let's hold on for a moment. Dr. Suarez.
Yeah, now that you mentioned, of course, HIE and participating organization, I was wondering, would there be also the possibility of participating individuals? Because if we focus on participating organizations and they are individuals, like a standalone physician, let's say, or maybe they operate as an organization too. But I was just wondering if there are participating individuals outside of organizations, because otherwise, many of these areas where there is a statement about the HIE and participating organizations presumes that only organizations are able to participate and not individuals.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be something to consider reviewing to see.
Yeah, I agree.
Who is a participant in the HIE? I know, for example, in TEFCA, they're going to be, of course, the QHINs and the participating organizations and then sub-participants, but there could be individuals that are participants as well.
Yeah, so that's an excellent point. So Kelly, if you highlight on one that particularly underscore where it says "and to the commission on a monthly basis." I mean, in all the years we've been at this, I don't think I've ever received one, frankly. And if we did get somebody that level of detail, I'm not sure how we would use it in a way that's actionable. So I think Dr. Suarez brings to light a good point, and we'll come back to this section. Alana.
Okay, so moving on then to section 8 regarding notice of breach and non-HIPAA violation. The first edit in A is just a deletion of the examples of HIPAA and high-tech. But then we add language to B, which adds specification for action in the event of a HIPAA breach, which is in line then also with C, which is kind of just simplifying the deleted language that was previously there.
Mm-hmm. Anyone have concerns here?
Mm-mm.
Okay.
Okay, so C1, again, just I think a simple deletion to the reference to HIPAA notification requirements. And the next edit we have is scrolling down a bit to D. So D1, there's an addition that specifies that, and I will pause for Angela.
Sorry, I didn't mean to raise my hand mid-sentence, Alana, I apologize. So if you scroll up, it's confusing when we're saying if any breach or violation is considered a breach under HIPAA and where a breach or violation is not a breach under HIPAA. So in the definition of breach, we reference specifically a HIPAA breach. So I
Right.
guess it should read if
It doesn't. I think Angela, you're saying it doesn't
that's
align with the definitions.
yeah.
Yeah. No. When you said that, I went, oh, boom. You're absolutely right. So we need to clean that up. Thank you.
The other element I wanted to mention is, and I agree absolutely with Angela, but the addition of the word violation in these statements. I mean, if it's a violation that ended up being a breach, then it's a breach. So why are we saying if any breach or violation is considered a breach? I mean, I think it's a little bit of a circular situation where a violation is a breach and then it's considered a breach, and it could be a breach under HIPAA. So I was confused about that addition of the word violation. I don't
Yeah,
know.
we'll flag this. Okay, Alana.
Okay, so the addition then to D1 specifies that knowledge of a person acting on behalf of a consumer or a patient, that knowledge be verifiable, and then it includes some examples of what the verification might be. So the proof of parentage or power of attorney or guardianship.
Mm-hmm.
Any concerns here? Okay. Next up.
All right, the next addition then is D3, which adds a requirement for how notification to a healthcare consumer is written, referencing Section 3, which are the requirements to provide consumers with educational materials about the HIE.
Okay, so let's look at this. Notification. And, Adrian, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so I'll make the same comment here that I made when we talked about the patient education materials, which is I think there was new language added which reduced the reading level all the way down to like a 5th grade. And while we agree and want to make sure that everything is done in plain language, we're gonna have a really hard time using words like Health Insurance Portability Act and meet a 5th grade reading level. So even just referencing the law is going to make any notice go above a 5th grade reading level. So I agree with exactly what we're trying to do here, that the notice should be in plain language and should be, readable to patients. But I still struggle with, this is another reason why we shouldn't maybe default to a reading level.
Yeah, and so I recently came across the Federal Rehabilitation Act, where it occurred to me that the language they used to define essentially the gist of it was everyone is supposed to have access to information that is written at a level that's understandable. Don't quote me on that because it's not the words, but the intent was, Adrian, exactly what you're saying. So Kelly, if you just note the Rehabilitation Act, and maybe we can take a look at it. We can ask our attorneys to look at it and see if that serves as a better example, since it's federal law anyway.
David,
yes.
Yeah, real quick, I would concur with that. I was just simply using old language that we typically use 5th grade level. I would agree that it should be reflective of what the current readability level should be for right now.
Okay, perfect.
Easily understood by anyone. And the other thing too, though, is we're talking about reading. There are other things that we may want to consider. We've not talked about those who are not able to see, those who may have have disabilities with sight as well. So I have not heard us talk about any of that on this call.
So it's funny you mentioned that, because the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Act includes language that combines the Rehabilitation Act with the issues related to disabilities. So I think it's interesting you made that, and it's just coincidence that I didn't know this before I came across it, so I don't want to present myself like I know all these federal laws when it's probably the only two that I know or recently. So let's take a look at these. I think you're making a good point, because the Rehabilitation Act, I don't think specifically calls out disabilities, but the Post-Katrina Emergency, I think that act actually includes it. But we can come back, but we'll look at it, because I think it's a good point to make sure it's comprehensive to include individuals with disabilities. Okay. So let's go a little further. We've got about 9 minutes left. Let's do one more section and then talk about next steps and wind us down so we don't hold anybody up on a Friday.
Okay, so in 4, then there's an addition which adds a requirement to make reasonable efforts to obtain sufficient and accurate contact information to provide notification of a breach or non-HIPAA violation to a healthcare consumer.
There's insufficient. Yeah, does anybody, Dr. Suarez?
I was just going to say, I think we have plenty of language about this on the HIPAA breach notification and other breach notifications. So I think referencing, being compliant with HIPAA and other federal and state laws, I think is, to me, the critical part, because I think that's what defines the degree to which we pursue obtaining sufficient and accurate contact info.
Right. I agree. So let's put a note and let's look at this. Okay, so let's take a look at if there's any questions about the additions to those that we see in 4, I think it's, or 5, 6, and then on screen in C. And we'll stop there.
Okay, so just the addition of the participating organization as a party that might discover a breach in 5. In 6A, it just includes an HIE and notification of remedial actions. And then in C, there's just the inclusion of a requirement to provide contact information for a participating organization involved in the breach.
Okay, so we may be going too fast. Dr. Suarez?
No, I mean, I think my sense is, and this is where I had the question before, a lot of this is applicable to the HIE and the HIE staff and employees and all that. But when we begin to add participating organizations, I think it begins to create a question in my mind about what do we as participant organization have to do with respect to these sections? I mean, I think I understand clearly what are the expectations for an HIE with respect to breaches and all that. But when we add a participant organization, then it creates a question as to whether the participating organization has to follow the same type of expectations or so I'm not sure if that was the intent or was the intent to have, if an HIE learn about a breach and it requires the engagement of a participating organization, then the participating organization can engage in that conversation. But if it's a breach within and inside a participant organization, that's a totally different.
So these are good points. So Kelly, there's participating organization is used twice in number 5. Can we highlight both of those? Because it gets back to, and in your comment note, where you're where you're considered to be a software developer who has an HIE capability. I think these are some of the challenge questions that I think Dr. Suarez and we've heard others say that are not as easy to solve for. So we may need to come back and take a look at those. So it is 5 before the bottom of the hour. So Alana, why don't you take us through to talk about next steps, and we'll wish everyone a great and hopefully a long weekend if you're able to take it.
Sure, gladly. So first, thank you all for your input today. I think we made great progress. We plan to pick up with where we left off next month in March. We have 2 potential dates held for a meeting during the week of March 21st. So we'll be sure to send out a calendar invitation and associated follow-up email in the next day or 2. And I think that about covers it in terms of next steps. David, any any closing remarks or anything you'd like to add?
Just quickly, Steve and Cindy, if you could stick around after this meeting for a moment, but to the folks in this work group on this policy board, we are deeply indebted. Your intellectual contribution is immeasurable, and we're very thankful to be aligned with your efforts in the way we are and have been for such a long time. So thanks for today, and hope everyone has a long and safe weekend, and look forward to talking to you as we get into March. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Take care, everybody.
See you, Dr. Connor.
Okay.
Okay, so I think Claire. Okay, so I didn't realize Claire was on. Sorry, I missed her on the call earlier. I didn't see your name. It didn't stand out at me. So for our Steve, Cindy, Claire, my reaction is I wonder if we can begin to start work on some of the things that the work group here has commented on, going back to the beginning in 01, and think about this and tell me if it's something you see that's